A warm welcome to everyone for the continuing series of JMP webinars. This one will be chaired by Haim, as usual, and we're very honoured to have Avi Shlaim join us to launch his book, which the details of how to order it will be posted in the chat. The meeting will be recorded and then placed on the JMP website, so you can go back to it and indeed share it with your own networks. Please ensure you are named accurately. Please mute yourselves and switch off cameras during the presentations, and please do so yourself so that the host does not need to do it. People may switch on cameras for the Q&A after the speaker's contributions. To contribute, please raise your electronic hand and unmute if called. Contributions should be to the point so we can share as many as possible in a limited time. Anyone attempting to interfere with the meeting will be excluded. So with that, I'll ask Norma Cohen and George Paxton and Shlomo San, please turn off your videos, and Hussein, please turn off your videos and mute, and I'll hand over to Haim. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you all for coming to join us. Now, Avi, I think, preferred that we would run this as a conversation rather than a lecture for 40 minutes or so, and then we will open it to the Q&A. So I will start and will not introduce Avi by reading the text which I sent to all of you by email, because we will be dealing with all those issues as we speak. I want to just say that I'm not an objective observer of this book or of Avi. I have followed Avi's work for many, many years. I admire his amazing contribution to the area of history of the Middle East, and especially issues related to Palestine and Zionism. And the book, for me, is a delightful addition to his amazing range of work. So I'm obviously not objective, but I'll try and cover with Avi the main issues that he deals with in the book. A few years ago, had an inkling by reading an article that Avi, you have written about your military service. And there I found his amazing sense of humor, gentle and at the same time penetrating to the issues. So if you have read the book, you know how beautiful his sense of humor is. If you haven't read the book, then after this, please do so. And I've just placed the link to buying of the book on Amazon. Well, Avi, welcome, and it is a great pleasure to have you with us, and a great pleasure for me as a colleague and a friend, a dear friend. I think I want to start by asking you to speak about the choice of the genre of this book. Now, you seem to have left behind the archive and all the procedures of the historians, though this is of course not true. When we read the book, we realize that this is just the first impression. But you seem to have left the signs of academic research behind, you know, footnotes and indexes, etc., and chosen a memoir for this book as a genre. Can you explain why you chose that and at the point that you chose it? And also, I really I love the name of the book. Probably you can talk about the wording of the title as well.
Thank you very much, Haim, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Before I answer your question, I would like to say how much I appreciated your kind words about me and about my book, and to tell our listeners that the admiration is mutual, because we've been friends, close friends, for a long time. We see eye to eye on most issues connected with Israel-Palestine. But in particular, we see eye to eye about the IDF. And you yourself wrote a book called An Army Like No Other, How the Israel Defense Forces Created a State or Created a Nation. And that is a remarkable book, and the title is very revealing. It shows the importance and the primacy of military power in Israeli society and in Israel's relations with the Arab world. So we are on the same wavelength. I was going to say we are singing from the same hymn sheet, but as neither of us is a Christian, that's not really appropriate. But I wrote a book a long time ago called The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World. And I updated it in 2014. And the updated edition is 900 words long. Sorry, 900 pages. But I can summarize it for our listeners in 2 sentences, which is that since its establishment, Israel has been reluctant, remarkably reluctant, to engage in genuine negotiations with the Palestinians to resolve the conflict between them. And on the other hand, Israel has been too ready to resort to force, not as a last resort, but as a first resort. So from the beginning, and even before the establishment of the State of Israel, Israel has relied primarily on military force rather than diplomacy. And let me add a word about the title of my book, The Iron Wall. I borrowed this title from Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the spiritual father of the Israeli right. In 1923, Jabotinsky published an article called The Iron Wall, We and Our Neighbors, or We and the Arabs. We and the Arabs. And the article was divided into 2 parts, a diagnosis of the problem and a prescription for dealing with it. And the diagnosis said, no nation has ever willingly made room for another people to come and create a state on its land. So Arab opposition to the Zionist project is inevitable. There is no diplomatic solution to this problem at this stage. And the answer was to build an iron wall of Jewish military strength. And the Arabs would hit their head against the ramparts and then give up the idea of defeating the Jews on the battlefield. And then will come the time for negotiations with the Palestinians. So this is all to emphasize our starting point, which is the IDF is an army like no other, and Israel relies primarily on military power. And the Iron Wall strategy has been the basic Zionist strategy in the conflict since the 1920s. Now, I'll come to your question, which is what prompted me to write this book. And the answer is that I hesitated a great deal before I started writing, because I didn't think that I'm a particularly important or interesting person. But I lived in interesting times. What encouraged me to embark on the writing of this book was reading a book by Orit Bashkin, an Israeli scholar, an Ashkenazi scholar, who is a professor of history at Chicago University, and her book is called New Babylonians, a history of the Jews in modern Iraq. And I learned a huge amount from this book. It's both an excellent history book and very informative, but also it's written with empathy towards Iraqi Jews. And this gave me the idea of not just telling my personal story, which is of limited interest, but of putting my story in the wider context of a family history, and putting the family history in the still wider context of the Jewish community in Iraq, and also adding further background on the history of Iraq after the First World War. So the book is a hybrid. It's not a conventional autobiography, and it only goes up to when I was 18, and it's a combination of the personal, the familial, and the political. I try to weave the personal and the political throughout the book. And indeed, I like to think of the book as an impersonal autobiography, because the first half is about the Jews of Iraq and about the Exodus in 1950-51 to Israel. And the second book is about me as a child. And my wife, Gwyn, read the book as I was writing it chapter by chapter. And when she got to chapter 5, she said, "I'm very worried because you haven't been born yet." So this is the central point about the book. It's not just a personal memoir, but it's also a document about a crucial history in a crucial period in the history of the Jews of Iraq and the transition from Iraq to Israel.
Just a question about the process of writing, which I think will interest people. I also had the same reaction when I started reading it that Gwyn had. Where is Avi? But of course, once you realize that this book is a hybrid and Avi didn't stop being the famous historian of the Middle East, but he's just added to his skills by writing a memoir, we value it even more. Was it written in the order that we read it?
No, it was written in the reverse order, because I wrote an introduction which was all over the place because I didn't know where I was going. And then once I started the chronological narrative, I hit my stride, and I used my skills as a historian, as a narrative historian, to tell a story chronologically. And that's how I work. The Iron Wall is a chronology, Israeli government, one government after the other. And I had a chronology, which makes it easy for me to write the book. And the same was true of my biography of King Hussein of Jordan. I had a chronology, and then I started writing his life phase by phase. But here, this was a new experience for me, and I didn't know how to go about it. So I wrote an introduction, what I thought the book would be about, and it was all over the place. And then when I'd finished the narrative and written the conclusion, I knew what the book was about. So I went back and I wrote a completely new introduction on the main themes of the book, which is the notion of the Arab Jew and the history of the Jews of Iraq, and in particular, the reasons for the Exodus.
Can I ask about the Arab Jew, that use the term Arab Jew? I think I'm right in suggesting that Ella Shochat probably was the first one that used it in a theoretical sense. You chose to speak of yourself as an Arab Jew, which I'm not sure that you have done before in the same way. So this is quite a bold attempt on the book cover to talk about an Arab Jew. Most Israelis would find this disturbing, and maybe quite a lot of Jews in Britain might wonder why you call yourself Arab Jew. Of course, this is what the book is about, but can you relate to this title?
That's a very searching question, and you're right. It's only in recent years that I began to call myself an Arab Jew. I never reflected very much about my identity. I used to be a bit naive in thinking we are given one identity and off we go. But when I started writing this book, I realized that identity is a much more complex and a much more fluid thing that evolves over time. That the subtitle, the Memoirs of an Arab Jew, is provocative, and it's meant to be. I only adopted this identity when writing the book, and I reinvented myself as an Arab Jew, is one way of putting it, but a more accurate way of putting it is that I rediscovered my identity as an Arab Jew. Because if you look at me in Baghdad up to the age of 5, we were Arab Jews, we were Iraqi Jews. We were Iraqis whose religion happened to be Jewish. But we're Arabs in every sense, every meaningful sense of the word. We spoke Arabic at home, our culture was Arabic, our lifestyle was Arab. But when I moved to Israel, age 5, Israel tried to erase my Arab roots and my Arab heritage, and to give me a new identity as a new Israeli. And I was never quite comfortable in this new identity, but Israel at school and later in the army was very successful in erasing my Arab identity. So now I reassert it. Edward Said called his Wreath Lectures Permission to Narrate. Now I asserted in this book my right to narrate my own history, to define my identity as an Arab Jew, and to rewrite, or rather to write our history, that of the Jews of the Arab lands, which isn't similar to the history of the Jews in Europe. And a major inspiration for this book and for the subtitle is indeed Ella Shochat, who is a very good friend of mine, and I warmly recommend to our listeners her book of essays, The Arab Jew, Palestine, and Other Displacements. So she wasn't the first to use the term. Other Iraqi Jews have used it before her, like Sasson Somer, who was a professor of Arab literature at Tel Aviv University, and Shimon Balas, who was another Iraqi Jew and a professor of Arabic literature at Haifa. He insisted on calling himself an Arab Jew against opposition from Israelis. But Ella Shohat was the first theoretician. She made this a pivotal concept rather than something incidental. And her book revolves around this concept of the Arab Jew. And she insists that the two are not antagonistic. The two complement one another. They are part of the same whole, rich whole. And for her, the hyphen in Arab Jew doesn't divide, it unites. So Ella Shohat was a major inspiration for focusing on the identity of an Arab Jew, asserting it, and also she read the first draft of the manuscript and made very helpful comments, not just about identity, not just about Arab Jews, not just about the parallels between the history of displacement of Iraqi Jews and that of the Palestinians, but also on the gender balance in the book, because I wrote the book about myself and my family, but mostly it's written from my perspective, and she asked me to write more about the perspectives of my sisters.
I think this is very interesting that it is Iraqi Jews as opposed to other Arab Jews that used the term systematically. And I want to return to that amazing community in Baghdad and Basra and other places in Iraq, and to speak about what makes it so special. Of course, the first thing that we all know is that it's the oldest diaspora of Judaism. It is more than 2,500 years old, and in a sense, it's there before the Arabs and before the Muslims, of course. In a sense, this is the oldest community in what we call Iraq now, but was called many names before. I wonder if you could describe in the way that the book is so richly doing the specific and unusual characteristics of the Iraqi Jewish community, which make it what it was, so unlike any other community in the world.
So the Jewish community in Iraq was the most ancient Jewish community. It had been there since the times of the Babylonian exile more than 2.5 millennia ago. But it also had a rich cultural life and theological achievements. The Talmud was written in Babylon. There were famous yeshivas of Surah and Pombedita. So there was a very rich spiritual life and scholarly contributions of this community. In modern times, after the First World War, the Jews were a very important element in Iraqi society. During the First World War, the Jews constituted 1/3 of the population of Baghdad. And Baghdad was often referred to as a Jewish city. The Jews played an important role in the building, in nation building, in the economic sphere, in the financial sphere, in the cultural sphere, in the educational sphere. It was a very successful and prosperous society. And the last thing I would say about it, what is very distinctive, is that of all the Jewish communities in the Middle East, it was the best integrated into Iraqi society. And there is an Israeli historian of Iraqi origins, Nissim Kazaz, who wrote in Hebrew. Unfortunately, it's not available in English. The History of the Jews in Iraq. And he defines the 1920s as the decade when the Jews of Iraq had an Iraqi orientation. They all joined in the national effort to forge a new nation. So that's the most important distinctive characteristic, that the Jews in Iraq were completely integrated into Iraqi society.
Thanks. I want to ask about an event which you cover very extensively in the book, and I think very beautifully. And that is the Farhud. Now, we know that Zionism was supported by around 1% of Jews in the countries of Europe, and even lower percentage in the Arab world. In Iraq, it was very low. And I think you just explained why it was so low. Can we speak about the Farhud, which was a terrible shock, of course, and how it affected the future of that community?
The Farhud, the pogrom against the Jews of Baghdad, happened on the 1st and 2nd of June 1941. And it's a very important event in Zionist historiography. The Zionist master narrative says that this attack on the Jews was a manifestation of Iraqi anti-Semitism, which had been there throughout the ages, which was pervasive, which was endemic, hatred and hostility towards the Jews. And this was only the clearest manifestation. I challenge this Zionist narration, rendition of these events. I explain that the Farhud was a much more complex phenomenon, and that the primary culprit was the British ambassador to Baghdad, Sir Kinahan Cornwallis. So there was an element of British colonialism, and to be more specific, Rashid Ali al-Kailani was an Iraqi nationalist who took power in May and stayed in power throughout May 1941. He was a nationalist, anti-British, and he succeeded in expelling the British from Iraq. The British said that he was pro-Nazi, but he wasn't pro-Nazi. He was a nationalist, and he got rid of the British. Then the British sent forces, a military force, and to Baghdad to reinstate the regent, Abdul Ilah. And Cornwallis told the British army to stay outside Baghdad, not to come into the city, because he didn't want the Iraqis to say that the regent was reinstated by British bayonets. But that was the reality. The British imposed the regent on the Iraqis. And it was during those 2 days that there was a breakdown of law and order, and the Farhud happened. So it wasn't a straightforward manifestation of anti-Semitism, or that was one element. There was the more complex history of Britain and its machinations. And my parents hated Cornwallis, Sir Kinahan Cornwallis. They thought he was responsible for the Farhud, but they couldn't pronounce his name. So they called him Al-Kalb ibn al-Kalb, the dog and the son of a dog.
I want to ask about another complex and difficult period a bit later on, after 1948, in which Iraq, of course, took part and sent, I think, 2 large units to fight in Palestine. There was an obvious tension But the Jews of Iraq have not moved to Israel. They stayed put. They were not Zionists. So I wonder if you could tell us from your own memories and perspective as a child of 5, what happened when bombs started to explode in Jewish synagogues and other institutions in Iraq in 1950?
Well, let me start with the Farhud 1941, and I don't think that was the really major turning point, because it shook, horrendous as it was, it shook the Jewish community to its core. But in the aftermath of the Farhud, the government instituted an inquiry and punished those responsible. And the consensus among the leaders of the Jewish community was that this was a one-off. It was an aberration from the course of Muslim Jewish history, and that life will go back to normal. That was the consensus. The real turning point for the Jews of Iraq was 1948, when the Iraqi army fought in the war for Palestine, and in the aftermath of the war, all of Israel's neighbors signed armistice agreements with Israel, but Iraq refused to sign an armistice agreement. It simply withdrew its army, and Iraq and Israel are still officially at war. But the Arab defeat in Palestine and the expulsion, the mass expulsion of the Palestinians from Palestine by the IDF created a backlash against the Jews throughout the region, not just in Iraq, but elsewhere as well. So this was 48, the establishment of the State of Israel was the real turning point. My mother said to me, she put her finger on this year, and she said to me, when the State of Israel was created, everything was turned upside down. And there's something important to understand about the creation of the State of Israel. Until now, the Jews did not have a state. Zionism gave the Jews a territorial base for the first time since the Babylonian exile. So it became easier for those Arabs who were hostile to Jews, like right-wing Arab nationalists, like the Istiqlal Party in Iraq, and as well as extreme Muslims who were prejudiced against Jews. The fact that there was a state, a Jewish state in Palestine, made it easier for them to identify the Jews not as one minority among many, but as aliens, as foreigners, and worse still, as the brothers of the Zionists who had stolen Palestine and carried out the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So the Jews of Iraq, whether they liked it or not, became identified with Zionism, and most of them were still opposed to Zionism. The majority had no interest in the Zionist movement or in moving to Israel. And once my mother used to talk about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one time, because I interviewed her repeatedly for this book, one time I asked her, did we have any Zionist friends in Baghdad? And she said to me very emphatically, she said, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us. And I think that she was representative of the majority of Iraqi Jews.
I think what you write in the book in 2 parts, because it takes you many years to find out that someone close to your family who was still alive in Israel when you wrote the book was one of the people who placed the bombs. So there you had proof that it was the Israeli Mossad that actually acted through the bomb to frighten Iraqis into leaving the country. Recently, you've been attacked by someone from UCL. He's not worthy of mentioning his name, but he's not a historian and definitely hasn't knowledge of this. And he claimed that you invented the whole thing. I think we are facing decades of denial of this and other actions by the Mossad, like the actions they took in Cairo in 1954. But of course, your family didn't know the facts. What did they think when the bombs started exploding?
In March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register, but they would leave on a one-way visa and not be able to return. And only a limited number of Jews avail themselves of this opportunity. The majority wanted to stay. Then in the course of the following year, 5 bombs exploded in Jewish sites in Baghdad. In 1950, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. By the end of 1952, there were less than 10,000 left. The majority had moved to Israel with transport provided by the Zionist movement. And these people, because they had no passport, couldn't go anywhere they chose or would have preferred to go. They had no choice but to end up in Israel. Now, it's not part of my argument that the bombs were the main reason for the exodus. I think the main reason for the exodus was persecution of the Jews by the government in the aftermath of the Palestine war. But the 5 bombs were a factor in the exodus. And there were always rumors of Mossad involvement in the bombs. I have produced evidence, both oral evidence from interviewing Yaakov Karkukli, who was a Zionist activist, who was involved in the underground and organizing the exodus. I have his oral evidence, and also he gave me a Baghdad police report which names the Iraqi Zionists who planted the bombs, 3 out of the 5 bombs. So I produced incontrovertible evidence. I didn't make this up. I produced incontrovertible written evidence from the Baghdad police, and I conclude that the 2 Zionist activists were responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. And my critics say that I exaggerate the impact, or either that I invented the Israeli and Zionist involvement in the bombs, either that I invented it, but the evidence is there, or they say I exaggerate the impact of the bombs. Now, let me say this. Even if the bombs did not induce a single Iraqi Jew to leave and to go to Israel, I would still denounce Israel strongly for being involved in these terrorist attacks, because Israel was created to provide a safe haven for Jews, for people like you and your family. it has no business recruiting Jews in Arab countries like Iraq, later like Egypt during the Lavon affair in 1954. It has no business recruiting local Jews, turning them into spies and terrorists, turning them into their homeland, and stage managing, orchestrating false flag operations in order to put pressure on the Jews to leave their homelands and to go to Israel. So even if the bombs did not result in one Jew going to Israel, I would still denounce it as a terrible example of what someone else has called cruel Zionism.
Thanks. I'll ask my last question because I'm sure everyone is dying to ask you questions. You were a very happy child. We get that very clear impression, and you are, supplying the evidence for a very happy childhood. Yet, when you arrive to Israel, I will just share the picture of little Avi in class in Israel. Lovely child, but seemingly very sad. Could you talk about this kind of move from a happy childhood in Iraq to a country that was less than welcoming, it seems, to your arrival?
Thank you. They say that a picture speaks more than 1,000 words, and this is a case in point. And in the book itself, there is also a photo of me as a 4 or 5-year-old in Iraq, and I look completely different. I'm very smartly dressed with a silk shirt and a bow tie and a vest, and I look self-confident and happy. So the two photos illustrate what happened to me as a child. We were an upper middle class, wealthy family. We had a very happy, comfortable life in Iraq. We had no interest in Zionism. Circumstances beyond our control catapulted us into Israel, forces that my parents couldn't even comprehend, which I now am only beginning to comprehend now, having done all this research. But for me, it was an upheaval. And when I arrived in Israel, I looked around me, and it was a very Ashkenazi society. The Ashkenazi people were the elite in every field. And although I did not encounter direct discrimination, I felt that the attitude of the Ashkenazi people was condescending, that they looked down on me because I was an Iraqi boy. This was something very subjective, and I certainly felt inferior. And I carried a chip on my shoulder, and throughout my time in Israel, and this sense of inferiority defined my relationship with Israeli society. I don't complain about this in the book. I simply describe what happened to me, and children are resilient. So my sisters and I learned Hebrew and got on with life. My mother was also resilient and resourceful. She learned Hebrew and she made Israel her own. But my father was 50 when we arrived in Israel. He didn't know Hebrew and he never made it in the new country. So the really sad story is not my story, but the story of my father, who was a very prominent figure in Iraq, a wealthy merchant who moved in high circles, was well respected, and he arrives in Israel He tries a couple of business ventures that fail, then he's unemployed, and he's a broken man. And he was silent. He never complained. He never talked about the past. He was completely silent. So in my book, I can't say very much about him and his family, but I joke with my daughter, who is a publisher, who helped me with this book, that my dad was completely silent and her dad never stops talking.
On this, you will need to continue talking because we will now open the Q&A. I wanted to ask you about the languages, Arabic and Yiddish, that were silenced, but I'm sure this will come up in the questions. So anyone that wants to ask a question, please raise your electronic hand. You look at reactions, and in reactions you will find your electronic hand. Please raise it, and I'll call you by the order of people coming up. If you would like to ask a question that I should read out because you prefer not to ask it yourself, please put your question into the chat and I will take it up. I think Tony Greenstein is first. He is always first, by the way. So Tony, please ask your question.
Well, I'm not quite sure I'm always first, Chaim, but thank you for the compliment. Firstly, can I congratulate Avi on what is a wonderful book? I have done a review of it, which I think you've seen, but I've read a number of reviews, in particular from Zionists, and they have been, I think it would be fair to say, universally hostile. Would you agree with me that even the concept of an Arab Jew is really the negation of Zionism, that the two cannot go hand in hand in almost any circumstances? And secondly, on the specific question of the bombs in Baghdad, because that's been covered by a number of different authors, David Hurst, Marion Wolfson, and so on. Would you not agree that one of the major reasons why the story is so credible is that it was widely believed amongst Iraqi Jews who went to Israel, that this wasn't some kind of harebrained idea that you and one or two anti-Zionists came up with, if you like, in your spare time, but it was extremely widely believed in Israel by them that the Zionists had in fact been responsible for what had happened. And maybe the other thing I would say is, I understand there were 6. Naim Giladi, I think, details 6 bombs, not 5. So I was just going to ask you about that, whether you're confident when you say there were 5 bombs, that there was only 5 bombs. And furthermore, that it's been said, Chaim said that you attributed the cause of the bombs, 3 of the bombs, to the Zionists. But from what I read, is you're really suggesting that they were responsible for 4 of the 5 bombs, including the one at the Masuda Shem Tov synagogue, albeit that they used someone who was a non-Jewish to actually carry it out. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, for the very thoughtful review that you wrote about my book. And you're quite right in saying that all the Zionist reactions to my book have been uniformly and comprehensively hostile. This was only to be expected. And I represent something the Zionists claim doesn't exist. I am a living example of an Arab Jew. They can't deny that I exist. Now, when I moved to Israel, my Arab identity was erased. and I was ashamed of my Arab heritage, and I was very ashamed of speaking Arabic. But now that I'm a grown-up, I have rediscovered my roots, and now I'm profoundly proud of my Arab heritage and my Jewish heritage, and I don't see any contradiction between the two. It's Zionism that says that there is hostility, it's preordained, the antagonism, and you can't be both an Arab and a Jew. But this is a very important basic flaw in Zionism, positing this antagonism between Muslims and Jews. And my family and I, for us, Muslim-Jewish harmony, coexistence, is not an abstract idea. It's something that we experienced, something that was normal. It was the everyday reality in Iraq. And therefore, to me, it is very important to recapture and reanimate that very different reality to the reality of Israel and the Palestinians today.
There is another question. Thanks. There's another question from Les Levidov. Les, please unmute.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the great presentation. I put a short version of my question in the chat, but I'll explain just a little more. So by emphasizing the concept Arab Jew, you have importantly recovered an historical legacy that was commonplace in the Arab countries before Israel's creation. I want to ask how you see the relevance today beyond simply setting straight the historical record. For example, I understand that among the Mizrahim, especially second or third generation, there's been an interest in actively recovering their Arabic heritage, some of them even visiting the Arab countries. And this has implications for politics as well, that is, for questioning this fundamental split between Arab and Jew as central to the Zionist project. So how do you see the, say, cultural and political potential today of recovering that concept?
Well, first of all, history is all important. And not only were we displaced from Arab countries, but our history was partitioned. And our history in the Arab lands was erased by the Zionist narrative. The American Jewish historian Salo Baron coined the phrase, the lachrymose version of Jewish history. And this may apply or applies to a certain degree to the history of the Jews in Europe, but it most certainly does not reflect the reality of Muslim-Jewish relations in Arab and Muslim countries. So what has happened is that the distortion of Muslim-Jewish relations in the Arab world at the service of Zionist propaganda. So to me, as a historian, it was very important to set the record straight about the past and to say, no, our experience was not like that of the Jews in Europe or the Jews in Nazi Germany. We had a completely different experience to that. Now, to come to the second part of your question, what are the implications today? That's more difficult to answer, but I maintain that there are deep cleavages in Israeli society, and that the Mizrahim, sadly for me, support in large numbers the parties of the Israeli right, as well as Shas, which is a religious party of Mizrahim. I would have liked the Arab Jews in Israel, to be a bridge between Israel and the Arab world. But this has not happened. Why are why do so many Mizrahim support nationalist parties? The Zionist answer used to be that they lived among Arabs, they knew what they were like, they knew that Arabs only understood the language of force. My explanation of why so many Mizrahim have always supported right-wing parties in Israel is that they were indoctrinated in Israel to hate Arabs.
Thanks. And before I let Pamela Blakelock to ask you her question, Tony is reminding me to remind you that you haven't related to the question of the number of bombs. Is it 3 or is it 4? If you can answer that, that would be good.
I can answer that very briefly. I know about 5 bombs, and Moshe Gat, who has written a book about this, also has 5 bombs and the dates. I don't want to enter into an argument with Tony Greenstein about whether there were 5 or 6 bombs. 5 bombs are 5 bombs too many, period.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. Pamela, would you please click your camera and unmute yourself?
Oh, yes. Thanks very much. It's great to hear about this book, which I haven't yet read. I'm Jewish, and I was brought up in a Zionist family in southeast London, and was part of Habonim Zionist youth movement. But I became an anti-Zionist in my teens when I discovered socialism, which was partly to do with staying on the kibbutz, where the ideas of socialism were supposedly put in practice, and which I found very inspirational. Anyway, so socialism is my main aim in life. In 2019, I visited the West Bank and Israel with the Israeli campaign against house demolitions, in conjunction with the Palestine Mental Health Network, UK. And one of the things I learned, which you actually partly answered in your answer to Les Levidoff, was that the young IDF members who were working on the checkpoints, disciplining the Palestinians who were going in and out of Israel from the West Bank, from the refugee camps, were mainly young Mizrahi Arab origin Israelis. And as I was very surprised at this, and as you were saying, there's been a lot of indoctrination. I also got the impression that the education of these young Mizrahi Jews, or family of origin Mizrahi Jews, had less educational standards. One of my cousin who lives there was a teacher, and she used to complain that they weren't interested in learning. She's actually a liberal, but yeah, so I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about that, as you say, a deep class division there between the Mizrahi Israelis and others. Thank you.
Thank you for your reflections. And of course, in the 1950s, Israel had a totally different image in the world. Israel was regarded as a socialist country, egalitarian country. The kibbutz had powerful appeal all over the world as a new way of life, liberal, progressive, egalitarian, socialist. So that was the image that Israel had in those days, and that was the reason, plus that Israel was a democracy, and that was the reason why Israel received so much international sympathy and support ever since. But look at Israel today. I don't need to elaborate. Israel today is an apartheid state, and 5 major human rights organizations in the last 2 years have issued reports which say clearly that Israel is guilty of the international crime of apartheid as defined by the Rome Statute. So Israel has come a very long way. It's not progressed, it's regressed. And the present government in Israel is the most right-wing, chauvinistic, homophobic, and overtly racist government in Israel's entire history. So this is where we are today. And why has this change come about? Again, you put your finger on it. Education. There is a clear, direct correlation between the level of education and political sophistication. The more educated you are, the more you see the complexity of Israel-Palestine. The more educated people are, the more dovish they would tend to be. And now the Mizrahim are relatively less well educated than the Ashkenazi Jews, and that translates into right-wing political positions.
Avi, I just want to extend the question a bit. Of course, I totally agree with what you said, but could it be also that having suffered lack of equality when arriving to Israel, and that lack of equality was done by people who call themselves socialists and left-wing, that disinclined Mizrahim from voting and supporting those left-wing organizations that were mainly organizations of Ashkenazis.
Thank you for adding this factor, which is a very important factor, and that is that in the first three decades of statehood, the Labour Party had political hegemony. It was the ruling party, and the Labour Party was very condescending towards the Jews of the Arab lands, and very aloof and arrogant, to some extent, the vote for Herut, which later became Likud, was a protest vote against the Labour Party establishment. And I deal with this from a personal perspective in my book. I say that when I was 14 or 15, there was an election in Israel, and I used to go to political rallies. And I remember vividly a political rally of Herut, of Menachem Begin, in the central square, and he was a spellbinding orator. And the main reason why he appealed to me and to other Mizrahim in the who gathered in the square, they were called derogatively Chachchachim, they're mostly Moroccans. The reason he appealed to us is because of his attacks on the labor establishment and its attitude to us. And he said to us, we are brothers, we are equal, we are both on the same side. And of course, it wasn't true, but it was persuasive and plausible. So he exploited the Mizrahi resentment of the labor establishment in order to build support for Herut and other nationalist parties.
I want, while people are working on the questions, I want to ask about the question of languages. You arrived at 5 years old in 1950. Your first language and your culture were Arabic, and that was basically discouraged. I arrived in 1948. My first language was Yiddish. There was only one area in which Mizrahim and Ashkenazim from the camps were treated in the same way, not in others, and that is that both languages were very strongly discouraged. Actually, Ben-Gurion wouldn't call Yiddish a language. He called it jargon, derogatorily. And both Arabic and Yiddish were unacceptable languages. Can you relate to that from your own background?
Yes, in fact, the opening scene in my book is about language and about the difficulty of language in moving from Iraq to Israel. And the opening scene is the summer. My friends and I are playing in the street in shorts and sandals. And along comes my father, and he's wearing a three-piece suit with a white shirt and a tie. And he speaks to me in Arabic in front of my friends. And I was acutely embarrassed because Arabic was meant to be an ugly language, a primitive language, and worse still, the language of the enemy. And here is my father speaking to me in Arabic. I blushed and I replied in monosyllables. I didn't make any sense. And I wanted to say to him, Dad, it's okay to speak Arabic at home, but in front of my friends, I would rather you spoke to me in Hebrew. But the whole point was that he couldn't speak Hebrew. And at that time, I only thought about how embarrassing this is for me. I didn't realize how humiliating this must have been to my father. In fairness to Israel, it wasn't just Arabic that was frowned upon, but also any other foreign languages, and there was emphasis on speaking only Hebrew. And Ben-Gurion was a fanatic about the Hebrew language. But not all members of the labor establishment were the same. Golda Meir, for example, once said, I don't understand how anyone who doesn't speak Yiddish can be a Jew. And the Black Panthers had posters which said, Golda, teach us Yiddish.
I want to ask a last question because there is another question here. April, could you unmute and switch your camera on?
Thank you very much. I thought it was, I'm very much looking forward to reading your book. It sounds extremely interesting, having lived in Iraq quite a long time. But it's a very simple, quick question, but for me to ask, but I think probably too much for anybody here to answer, which is why are the UK socialists so terrified of criticizing the present government, or the present Zionist government? When there was such a background of socialism, it seems terribly sad that the present UK socialists seem incapable of criticizing anything that the Zionist government do at the moment.
The Jewish community in Britain is not monolithic. And the Labour Party, of which I'm a member, is divided. I belong to Jewish Voice for Labour, and we are on the left wing of the Labour Party, and we are anti-Zionist or non-Zionist.
Yeah.
We are supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, and we are vocally critical of Israel. But the majority of Jews in the Labour Party belong to the Jewish labor movement. They are the mainstream, and they are a Zionist group, and they are almost totally uncritical of Israel and wouldn't countenance any criticisms of Israel. So opinion in the Labour Party is divided, and Jeremy Corbyn paid a huge price for his honesty and decency in standing up for Palestinian rights. And the Israel lobby, orchestrated by Israel and the Israeli embassy in London, they were responsible for weaponizing anti-Semitism, manufacturing false charges against Jeremy Corbyn, and destroying his political career. So what is, more broadly, what is happening in recent years is the weaponizing in the country, and this is not just the Labour Party, but across the board. What is happening is the weaponizing of anti-Semitism in order to silence legitimate, evidence-based criticisms of Israeli policies, especially towards the Palestinians. And the IHRA definition is a non-definition, it's vacuous, and its sole purpose was to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and to tar with the same brush of anti-Semitism anyone who dares to speak up for Palestinian rights and to criticize Israeli policies. This is a very dangerous phenomenon. So I would like to express my views very clearly, and that is there's no connection. These are two different things. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews because they are Jews. Anti-Zionism is criticisms of the state of Israel and its policies. And the two cannot be conflated.
Thank you very much, because I was horrified last week where there was a lecture where the Archbishop of Canterbury refused to say that it was an apartheid state. So it gave me great joy and really, great strength to hear you have the courage to stand up and say it is an apartheid state. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, April. And Pamela, I'll ask Diana to ask her question first. Diana, could you unmute and click your camera?
You cannot start the host has stopped it. I'll check. You've stopped my camera, so I don't know. I can't.
Okay, I'll
Yes.
Yeah, you can start it now.
Okay. No, it's still okay. What I wanted to say is, some time ago, I was in New York and there was an exhibition of Moroccan Jewish culture. And I went to see it and it hit me so strongly. There are so many Jewish cultures throughout our history that have somehow been forgotten, buried, whatever we want to say. And when I think of the Zionist history, it's very much a history of tragedy, and then the phoenix rose from the ashes. And somehow so much of a wonderful history has been lost, and so much of what the Jews achieved as diaspora people of the world, as they say, rootless cosmopolitans, that's gone. And somehow I'm grateful for you for bringing for bringing out, for disinterring a history of a people, which is so vital. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on the fact that Jewish history hasn't properly been developed. Rather, we've got what's now a Zionist history, a history of Israel.
Thank you very much, Diana. And for the listeners who don't know you, I will identify you as a Jewish member of the Labour Party who was expelled from
not. I haven't been expelled. I've been accused and found guilty of anti-Semitism.
Because you are an anti-racist and Israel is a racist state. So you're an example, you're a victim of precisely what I was saying a minute ago, that anti-Semitism is weaponized against people who are anti-racist. In fact, in the Labour Party, if you're Jewish, you are 30 times more likely to be investigated for anti-Semitism than if you are not Jewish. Now, the Zionist history, as you said, overlooks the achievements of the Jews all over the world and the periods not of persecution, but of peaceful coexistence and creative coexistence and Jewish contribution to all the societies where they lived. I mentioned the lachrymose version of Jewish history, which is Jewish history as a never-ending chain of hatred, persecution, discrimination, and hostility towards the Jews, culminating in the Holocaust. And the consequence of this, if you adopt this version of history, is that the Jews become victims. Broadly speaking, I agree, or it's arguable that the Jews were victims until 1948. But the Jews have not been victims in the Middle East since 1948. Since 1948, the boot has been on the other shoe. The one with the whip hand, the one with the military power is Israel, not its neighbors. It's Israel which has occupied Arab lands. It's Israel which oppresses the Palestinians. It's Israel which has imposed an apartheid regime on millions and millions of Palestinians. And yet, the Israelis claim that they are the victims. They are the victims of Arab hostility. They completely distort the reality in which Israel is the occupier, Israel is the oppressor, and Israel is the one that habitually violates international law and international humanitarian law. So this is the reality, that the Palestinians are the victims and Israel is the oppressor, or if you wanted to a more moderate formulation of the relationship, it's the one that Edward Said suggested, which is that the Palestinians are victims, but they are the victims of victims, because the Jews in their time were also victims. And Edward Said, in an article on coexistence, talked about the two as two communities of suffering. And he appealed to Arabs to take into account the suffering of the Jews over history and to understand that it's because of their suffering that the Jews are obsessed with security. I would like to end on this note, Saidian note, that the Jews have also suffered, but today it's not the Jews who are suffering, but it's the Jews who are imposing suffering on the Palestinians. And what I would like to do is to reverse this situation and to show what unites us rather than what divides us. And I see the parallel between the displacement of the Palestinians from Palestine and the displacement of Iraqi Jews from Iraq and other Jews from Morocco, from Yemen, and to try and build on what unites us to build a better future, which is based on the model that we had before Israel was created.
Thank you very much. And to the last question, please be brief, because this has been a very long and tiring webinar for, especially for Avi, who has to face the questions. Danny Flexa, please unmute and click your camera. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so very quickly, you mentioned the victimhood of the Iraqi Jews, and also in your last sentence, you also mentioned the victimhood of other Jewish communities. To what extent would you say that the other Jewish communities suffered in Arab countries suffered a similar fate to the Iraqi Jews? And could you say who were the top three of the others? I mean, I know about the Yemenites, as I think there is some parallel since they were proactively expelled with the help of the Zionists. So who would you say suffered similarly to the Iraqis in terms of the other Jewish communities?
The Yemenite Jews were the first large community to be transplanted from the Arab land to Israel. And this happened in 1949, before the Iraqi exodus. And the British were instrumental in allowing Israel to gather the Yemeni Jews, something like 50,000, and to bring them to Israel. And they suffered, they tended to be very poor, not very well educated. Some of them were religious Jews who wanted to go and live in the Holy Land. That was one community. The largest Arab community was the Moroccan community. A very large number of Moroccans ended up in Israel. And in the case of many of them, it was against their will. The Mossad established headquarters, a station in Rabat, and the Mossad organized the exodus or the migration, the aliyah of a large number of Moroccan Jews to Israel. Unlike the Iraqi Jewish community, which moved to Israel en masse with all its professionals, with all its lawyers and doctors and leaders, the leadership of Moroccan Jews tended to go to Paris, to France, and the rank and file ended up in Israel. And in Israel, the Moroccans were the bottom of the bottom of the pile, and they suffered most in Israel. In relative terms, Iraqi Jews did better than any other Jewish community from the Arab countries. So there was a hierarchy of suffering, different degrees to which Israel was responsible for the Aliyah, and different degrees to which they managed to assimilate in Israel and to establish a new life for themselves in Israel.
Thank you. I actually promised Avi that this will not be longer than an hour and a half. But if it's possible, Avi, for you to spend another 5 minutes, there are two other people that want to ask. It's up to you.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Iris, please be brief and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you, Avi. That was and Chaim. Thank you so much for that. I just wanted to remind us about Ethiopian Jews and how tragic their situation has been as well. Finished, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And can I, before Avi relates to this, ask Lamis to ask his question? Please unmute Lamis.
Hello. I'm trying, but the video doesn't seem to be. Oh, here we go. Yes. This is not a question. It's just a little note to say to Avi that I am an Iraqi who lives in London. I come from a Muslim family. My mother told me a lot about Farhud when it happens and they were passing in front of their house and how they were trying to help those people by inviting them into their own houses, and all the friendship and the pain they had to go through when they saw this happening. And I also would like to say that the society of Iraq at the time was very different. There was the friendship and the love in between those families was just amazing. I have a lot of stories. And I must say that I am honored to meet you, Avi, and to relate to so much to what you were talking about. And a lot of this, something that I have heard and I've been in contact with. A few years ago, I was really hurt when all these political problems of Iraq. So I left my job and I sat down and wrote the Iraqi cookbook. And in that book, I was trying to collect some Jewish recipes. And I must say that was not easy. But of all the recipes, which were about 200 odd recipes in my book, I managed to collect only few. And I don't know if you know anybody who would be familiar with some Jewish recipes from the Iraqi culture. And I thank you very much for. And I also would like to say my uncle also, because at the time, it was a completely different time. He married a Jewish woman. So some of my cousins are half Jewish, but unfortunately, I lost contact with most of my relatives in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. It illustrates what I was trying to say about a time when there was harmony between Muslims and Jews. I can recommend a Jewish cookbook. It's by Daisy Iny, I-N-Y, and it's called The Best of Baghdad Cooking. And it's got wonderful recipes. And in particular, it has a recipe for masgouf, which is barbecued fish, which is a Iraqi Jewish delicacy. And my mother was the best cook that I've ever had. And my mother taught my wife, who is Welsh, to do Iraqi Jewish cooking. But the wider point that you raised is also important about Muslim-Jewish coexistence. My book is called Memoirs of an Arab Jew. Any Arabs born after 1948 would have no concept, would have no idea that Jews once lived in the Arab world.
Yes.
This is a completely new idea for them.
Yeah.
And as I said, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq in 1950. Today, there are 3 Jews. In the whole of Iraq, there are only 3 Jews left. And therefore, what I'm saying about Arab Jews is completely new. And for this reason, it's generated a lot of interest and a lot of debate in the Arab world, in the Arabic media. There is a lot of talk about this, a debate about Arab Jews, and also many articles, reviews and articles of my book. So I'm pleased that to a very modest extent, I've been able to revive and generate interest around this pivotal notion of the Arab Jew.
But have you heard of a dish called tabit?
Of course I heard of tabit. I used to eat it because my grandmother lived with us in Baghdad, and she was illiterate, and she was an Orthodox Jew, a practicing Jew, and therefore she wouldn't cook on the Sabbath. So she used to make tabit, which is stuffed chickens and rice.
Yes,
And on top of the rice, she would put eggs, and she would cook this on a very slow flame overnight. And in the morning, we would have brown eggs, which we would use for an Iraqi breakfast, which is brown eggs with salad, with fried aubergines and mayonnaise or tahini, and mix it all together and eat it in pita. Absolutely delicious. And a variant of that is sabih. And in Israel, there is sabih everywhere. And
oh,
there
yes.
in London that also have falafel and sabih.
All of them in my book, but I thought there would be more. I will get this book, and thank you so much. It's an honor to meet you, Avi.
It's a pleasure for me to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for sharing with us the recipes for what sounds like excellent dishes, which I am unable to eat because I'm not eating meat or fish, but it sounds great. Now, I want to end by thanking Avi.
The best of the vegan, I listed in my book also the vegan Iraqi cookbook.
Thanks.
Many of them are Jewish.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now, before closing the meeting, I want to thank our friend and member, Avi Shlaim, for not just writing an excellent book, but spending almost 2 hours answering questions and ending on the notion that Jewish Network for Palestine strongly supports the notion of convivencia of Jews and Arabs, of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and just reminding everyone that it is the Europeans that invented anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. It wasn't the Arabs, the Muslims, and that most of the period of 2,000 years that Jews have lived, among others, they lived in peace and harmony with the Arabs and Muslims. And you would know of the convivencia in Spain, in Al-Andalus, that lasted almost 800 years. And Avi is reminding us that that is the message that Arab Jews can send to us and should send to us and to everyone, to persuade us that Jews can live with Arabs, Muslims, and Christians in peace and harmony, as long as Zionism is defeated, as long as apartheid is defeated, as long as the victims of Zionism can live in peace, including the refugees. Thank you, Avi, for reminding us the most important things that we need to know about the conflict. Thank you, everyone, for coming. The recording will be available by tomorrow, I hope. and we'll see you at our next webinar. I just want to mention that the Israeli Committee Against House Demolition is running a conference on the one-state solution, which is a solution of one state, democratic state in Palestine, and it is a convivencia solution, and therefore we are supporting it fully. And this is happening on the 30th of this month, and you need to register. Please look at our Facebook and register for this if you're interested in peaceful convivencia in Palestine. Thank you very much.